Broad daylight in East Cleveland. An ordinary day until one moment, something out of the ordinary.
What happens on October 20th, 2009 is about to change everything. This 911 dispatcher gets a call. The caller is frantic.
She fell out the window upstairs on the second floor.
Okay, are you scared?
She laying on the ground, butt neck.
He's just watched this woman come flying out of the second-story window. And he's saying, she's on the ground here. They're saying, is she alive? Is she breathing?
With her right now?
I'm right here right now. She's laying on the ground, butt neck.
She just came flying out of this window. He doesn't know if she was thrown, if she jumped, if she fell. He just knows there's something wrong here.
There's a man inside the house. His name, Anthony Sowell.
You know, he told the police, well, we were just using drugs together, and she accidentally fell out of the window.
Sowell has already enticed 11 women to use drugs inside 12205 Imperial Avenue.
He selected his victims from a group of people in a community that would be hesitant to step forward and be witnesses.
I got mad and I was like, cussed him out and told him to get the out of my house.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Anthony Sowell as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake?
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Like and subscribe.
There is a gap between buildings in East Cleveland where once stood number 12205 Imperial Avenue. As long as Anthony Sowell could hide what is inside 12205, he would remain a free man. Because inside, he's hiding grim secrets. In one room, the decomposing bodies of 2 women. In another, a further 3. And outside in his yard, yet more. What is known about the man who had frightened a woman so much that she threw herself from the second story of 12205 Imperial rather than stay a second longer? A man who would spend hours being interrogated by police and who seemed at ease throughout as he proudly discussed his 4 grandchildren.
You have 4? Yeah, 4. They call you Papa or Grandpa?
Oh.
Yeah?
And
You love that, don't you?
no,
You do.
it's okay, no. But that's everybody call me that.
Yeah, that's the love for them. So I know that you probably be skinning and grinning.
Yeah,
don't you?
yes, you do.
Don't you? You don't be grinning when they be coming up to you?
Anthony Sowell seemed happy in police company, happy in the company of everyone.
Many times when somebody is arrested, you hear their neighbors say, they were so quiet. I never knew there was anything wrong. I didn't think that they were capable of such a crime. I can't believe that that is my neighbor that did that. And that's what makes them so effective, is that they can blend in.
He really had this kind of outward appearance to the neighborhood where he would hold barbecues and chat with people. They didn't really suspect him of doing anything like this.
He could snap. People had seen him lose his temper.
So it's kind of these 2 personalities that people would describe seeing. You know, he had at least 1 or 2 girlfriends at the time that we were able to hear from afterwards who talked about, you know, the long conversations they would have and how, you know, kind and introspective he could be. But then he could also be very violent if someone disagreed with him or didn't, you know, didn't say the right things.
but a killer, not Tony Sowell, the party guy.
There is no sign, no neon sign on anybody that says I'm a serial killer, I kill for a living. There is no sign at the intersection that you often see people hold, the I will work for food. They're not holding signs that say I will kill for pleasure.
Anthony Sowell's killing story begins to be uncovered with a 911 call.
She looked like she around about 40.
About 40? All right.
Yeah.
Is she conscious?
She can't get up, though.
But she is awake, right?
Look, I ain't even trying to go near her. I gave her my T-shirt to put on.
Is she awake?
She kind of awake and going in and out.
Breathing?
Yeah.
And which window did she fall out? The first or the second?
Oh, no.
Was it less than 6 feet or more than 6 feet?
The second, yeah, 12, 15
All right.
feet.
All right. There we go. And it happened just now, correct?
Yeah.
The call had been made in a neighborhood of East Cleveland where violence was not uncommon. In fact, a year ago, another woman had fled from 12205.
December 2008, a woman in the neighborhood named Gladys Wade frantically flags down a police car. She tells the officers that she was attacked. She's got scratches on her neck, she's got a deep gash in her right thumb, and she says what happened is Anthony Sowell asked her if she wanted to go drink beers with him, and when she said no, he punched her in the face, knocked her out, and dragged her into his house, where he proceeded to choke her and tried to rip off her clothes. She said he had just this evil look in his face. She said it was like the eyes of the devil were glowing, and she said she fought back and tried to scratch his eyeballs out.
Police visit the owner of 12205 Imperial, where the attack had taken place, and hear a different story from Anthony Sowell. Gladys had hit him, he said. The officers decide this is a domestic. They don't want to get involved, and they want to quickly get out of the house. It is littered with trash and smells very badly.
They smell this horrible stench, but they see trash everywhere. It's just a pit.
They wanted to get away from the neighborhood too.
Mount Pleasant. The name Mount Pleasant at that time really was almost cruelly ironic because the neighborhood by then had really hit the skids. There was a lot of poverty. 1 in 5 houses was up for foreclosure. There was a lot of crime. This was a rough neighborhood. A lot of the residents of the area had fallen victim to the crack epidemic of the time, and a lot of those people were women. And so they would roam the streets, searching for their next hit, and that made them easy prey for ruthless predators like Anthony Sowell.
Not that he was considered a predator. As likable as he appeared to be to some, not many did actually know much about Anthony Sowell.
You know, he wasn't a person that everybody immediately had a specific memory of, but he was kind of always in the background, maybe a little bit socially awkward.
Sowell was an ex-serviceman. He'd been a model Marine.
Maybe the stringent rules in the military were good for him for a while. I know that he was able to, cope in the military, do his job. He listened, he followed orders, directions, never really got in a lot of trouble.
He would later tell probing detectives of his pride at his record.
How long were you in the service?
7 years.
7 years?
He'd done a 7-year tour of duty, and from everything that we know, he did well. He was a good serviceman.
You realistic? You like been in the Marine Corps?
I was good at it.
Yeah.
In 1989, 4 years after leaving the military, it all begins to go wrong.
When he gets out, he starts having problems. He breaks up with his girlfriend, he stops going to work, and he loses his job, and then he turns to drinking pretty heavily. He's pretty much drinking all day. Beer was his vice, and things are kind of falling apart for Anthony Sowell.
The drunk Sowell would target vulnerable women and entice them back to his place. And then things would get ugly.
It wasn't long that he was home before he was actually accused of harming several women. And actually 2 in kind of close proximity. There was 2 women both of whom were pregnant, but also, either abusing drugs or hanging out with people who were drinking, that Anthony Sowell was accused of raping.
His accuser, a pregnant woman, claims that he wouldn't let her go after she agreed to spend time with him.
A woman goes to police and she tells them that Anthony Sowell attacked her inside his home, that he bound and gagged her and raped her.
Sowell avoids jail, but not for long.
He was never prosecuted for that case because he was actually arrested for another case, another rape, within the same year. And he was prosecuted in that case. He ended up pleading guilty to attempted rape and was given a sentence of up to 15 years in prison.
Sowell refuses to plea deal to contest what had happened, and he declines the chance of early release by admitting his guilt.
His parole is repeatedly denied. When he gets out, because he's served his entire sentence, he's not on parole. So he's not under police supervision. As a sex offender, he has to register, and police have to verify his address, but that's pretty much it. He's pretty much free and clear. In
2005, Anthony Sowell is released. After a long prison stretch, during which time he'd been a model prisoner, he's back in 12205 Imperial Avenue, where police in the East Cleveland neighborhood are dealing with a drugs epidemic. Because of his offense, he's on the sex register and dutifully attends the sheriff's office every 90 days as ordered. He was not someone they considered a problem ex-con. He was Tone, the party guy from Imperial.
Serial killers also tend to be very smart. Almost sociopathic, some of them can be, and your sociopaths can also be very charming. And when somebody is charming, people like them. They have relationships, they build families and friends, and so therefore, people aren't going to question them. They would never imagine that Anthony Sowell or other serial killers out there could do the evil that they do.
By 2007, Tony Sowell was living alone at 12205 Imperial, his parents having passed away. Drugs had flooded the Mount Pleasant neighborhood.
The city was kind of getting poorer. There was the crack epidemic was really starting to affect the streets. There was a lot of mothers and fathers starting to use those drugs.
Sowell set about preying on the women made vulnerable by their dependence on drugs. His own days were dominated by booze.
He was really the kind of guy that was doing a lot of drinking. He'd go to the store in the morning and get a beer and just kind of continue that throughout the day.
A pattern was set. The drunk Sowell would home in on vulnerable women and entice them back to his place. 12205 Imperial Avenue became quite the party venue.
He would say, hey, do you want to come in and have a drink? And his house was a place where he would let people crash if they were using drugs and didn't want to go home. The house, you could tell, it was definitely used for a place where people could just crash and could just party. There was beer bottles or beer cans all around.
The rundown quarter of East Cleveland offered perfect conditions for the predator Sowell. Drug-confused women, a place of his own to take them, and a meeting venue where he could also get beers.
There was a little corner store right there that was kind of the hub of activity on Imperial Avenue. They were really familiar with Anthony Sowell. He would come in and buy, tall beers, King Cobra beers, which he would drink often. People would come over to the store when they would come to his house, buy beer, party, kind of back and forth.
When partying with Sowell, the menu was easy to predict. He might help cook up some drugs, and he might follow it up with a 6-pack of beers. Then it would be time for sex, whether the women wanted it or not.
Every female that you have brought to the house, have each and every one of them used drugs or using drugs like crack or whatever? Is that one of the reasons why they come to your house? So they can smoke from okay. And you telling me that you don't do that?
I used to,
but you don't do that.
Sometimes.
On May 17, 2007, Crystal Dozier was wandering the streets of Mount Pleasant. She's spotted by Tony Sowell. She fitted a then all too familiar East Cleveland profile.
Then I'm trying to get the type of women that come to your house. And this is the type of women that come to your house are one drug users. Outright drug users. Very sure.
Crystal Dozier was the mother of 7 children. Her own family remembers that Crystal, when she was a little girl, she was the responsible one. She's the one you could always count on. And she loved helping around the house and learning how to cook. And she really liked pretending she was a grown-up. She loved getting dressed up. But drugs changed everything.
Did you like him, though? Did you like him when you met him?
Yes.
Okay. So you weren't mad at him when you met him. You kind of liked him all, right?
Yes, yes.
And by the time she was in her early teens, her life was just basically spinning out of control. She never shook her drug habit.
They all had these vulnerabilities that Anthony Sowell appeared to hone in on.
So I looked at her, and she looked so sad and pitiful, like she just had a rough time. So I said, a beer? I said, how you gonna get a beer? I said, it's closed. Oh, they'll open up or something like that. Okay. So I said, I tell you what, come on with me. You can get all the beers you want.
Sowell invited her into 12205. He has raped before, but he has never killed. Nothing would be heard about Crystal for 2.5 years, her anguished family unable to find her. She had been raped, then strangled.
The most personal way to kill somebody is to strangle them. And in Anthony's case, it was personal and close. And so he was able to watch, and literally watch, the breath of life come out of that person.
Her killer buried Crystal by the backyard fence of 12205. She had become victim number 1 of Anthony Sowell. There was no reported sighting of Crystal before her murder. Possibly she had been whisked into 12205 in darkness. Possibly detectives were not getting all of the information they could from a community at times at odds with the police.
He selected his victims from a group of people in a community that would be hesitant to step forward and be witnesses.
Other drug-addicted women were lured into 12205 around the same time.
And those women had gone to Anthony Sowell's house maybe to use drugs or drink or just hang out with him, and had never left the home.
As for Sowell, he was not suspected of any involvement in the disappearance of Crystal Dozier. There's even a suggestion that he may have tried to mend his ways.
He participated in Alcoholics Anonymous, so he was aware that he had an alcohol problem.
AA did not work. There is no indication that Sowell took a day off from his heavy drinking. And when he was drunk, he would want to have sex. He would head out looking for a sex worker. One like Tashana Culver, who went missing in June 2008. A young woman drifting in and out of family life.
Tashana Culver had tried to get clean. It just never took. The pull of the drugs was just too strong. But she had once had hopes and dreams. She'd gotten her cosmetology license. She'd even trained to be a medical assistant. But drugs basically consumed her life. She was 33 years old. She had 6 children.
Her family was slow to report her missing. She disappeared so often. She was dead within 2 hours of entering 12205. His killing method of choice were his bare hands. Sowell had perfected strangling by now.
They will learn, they'll do everything the same, but this time they'll bring a gun. So it also is a learned behavior. They learn from their mistakes. And so throughout the years, Anthony learned from his mistakes and kept on trying to protect his craft.
Can you tell me exactly what did you do with your hand?
I can. That's why I could tell you there wasn't no weapon.
He didn't start out killing. I would bet that he learned and progressed to that point. And as he was successful with his first rape, he would do the next one and the next one and try new things. And in this particular case, ultimately, as a serial killer, he got the thrill from watching his victims die.
What, they would like piss you off or something, maybe? Or what? What do you think would cause you to choke him? I mean, just off the top of your head. Think about it. Punish him?
My girl and them, something. That's all I can say.
That was punishing them because of...
I was the punisher. Like, I can't explain it.
As for the residents of Mount Pleasant, all they knew for sure was that something bad was coming from somewhere in the neighborhood.
Before long, people in the area start complaining about this horrible smell in the neighborhood. It is just a rotten stench. At least one neighbor calls the city and says, "You got to do something about this. This is just horrendous. It smells like something died, something or someone," but it kind of gets waved off by the authorities.
Right next to the house where Anthony Sowell lived on Imperial Avenue was a place called Ray's Sausage. And for years, when there had been foul odors that the neighbors noticed, they would call the city or call the health department. When people would come out, they would always attribute the smells to Ray's Sausage. And in fact, the people that own this very small family-owned sausage company redid their entire sewer system, thinking that somehow the smell was being attributed to them, their sausage making, their dumpsters. You know, we only realized later that it was probably Anthony Sowell. And in fact, the owner said at one point that they believed that he may have dumped some bodies in their dumpsters.
The upshot after the complaint was that an opportunity to stop a killer killing was ignored.
The smell remains, and it just hangs over this neighborhood, just this rotten stench. The house where Anthony Sowell is living is just filthy, full of garbage, and definitely there's this horrible smell coming from there, but nobody ever does anything.
No mistake yet big enough for cops to stop Sowell, who carries on picking up sex workers when drunk and attacking them. Not always successful in his attempts to kill them.
There was a number of women who actually made it out of Anthony Sowell's house, and each of them also described either being choked or strangled by him quite aggressively, sometimes with like a cord or a strap, other times with his hands.
I was the punisher. Like, I can't explain it.
Those who had escaped Sowell's punishment had not told police of their ordeal, fearful that they may be arrested for drug use and prostitution themselves. One woman would not reveal what she had seen inside 12205 until Sowell was safely locked up.
She caught a glimpse of one of the decomposing bodies, which frightened her and just made her, realize, I have got to get out of here.
So, what went on behind the door of 12205 Imperial remained undetected, uninvestigated. Sowell's good fortune and the fact that he was yet to make the mistake of attracting the police to his door meant that he was still free. Between 2007 and 2008, women continued to go missing from Mount Pleasant.
Their loved ones that they did love would go missing, but they would always call after a day or two. They would always come back. They would never miss important events like birthdays or Christmas. And so when they went missing for a longer period of time and didn't show up, a lot of them contacted the police and said, this is different. And we're basically told, hey, they'll come back when they're done using drugs.
After all, who cares about women who often go missing for a living? 1 minute on the streets, the next selling sex in a location nobody knows of. Sex workers make perfect targets for serial killers.
So the police were dismissive of these women for the same reason that Anthony Sowell likely targeted them.
Anthony picked his victims because they were vulnerable.
All his targets were black, drug-addicted, and desperate for cash. Choosing the same profile of victim is familiar territory for serial killers, and rapists too, like Anthony Sowell.
The very first time that they're successful, they will continue to do the crime the same way every single time. Rapists are no different. If they were successful with a brunette living in an apartment, all their victims will be brunettes living in an apartment.
I think he probably knew that people weren't going to come, beating down his door looking for these women.
And so the killing went on. LaShonda Long's life had never been easy.
LaShonda Long was the youngest of Anthony Sowell's victims. She was only 25. LaShonda's mom had been a crack addict. Her dad had been an alcoholic. And LaShonda's life pretty much fell into that pattern.
It was only a matter of time before Sowell would find her. She was simply not able to defend herself, her life distorted by drugs and bad choices.
LaShonda had her first child when she was just a child herself. She was 14 years old. At 17, she had 3 children, and she'd lost custody of all of them.
He hated the fact that they used drugs and would even say things to them about it, and know he wanted to help them, but then he would also do it himself. So he definitely had this strange relationship where he would meet women who had drug problems. He would kind of entice them into his home, with the idea of drinking or using drugs. But then he would also try to be very caring. Well, let me get you some clothes. Let me feed you. You look like you need to eat.
I know one thing I think always made me mad is they had kids.
And they was out in the street.
Yeah. That's a big thing in my head.
LaShonda's fate was to be a gruesome one.
One family, I think it was LaShonda Long, the only thing they really recovered of her body was her head. It was in a bucket in the basement, which was very difficult for them. They didn't even have a body to bury.
Sowell would describe his victim as pitiful, but he himself took no pity on them. The next woman to be enticed inside Imperial 12205 was Tonya Carmichael.
Tonya Carmichael vanished in November of 2008. She was 33 years old. She was a drug addict, but she hadn't always been. She was once the protective mother who would chase away the drug dealers from her doorstep because she didn't want them to influence her children. But eventually she fell into drugs.
Her life kind of intersected with Sowell's early on. They both grew up on Page Avenue. She knew him, probably tangentially. The families kind of knew each other.
The addiction had led her to crime, to prison, away from her children, and eventually into the hands of a serial killer.
She went looking for a hit and a bed for the night and chose 12205. She was not long for this world after taking that decision.
When she initially went missing, her family went to police and they were asking for help to find her. And the police said, well, we know she has a drug problem. She'll come home when she's done using drugs.
When Tonya went missing, her family says they went to police right away. The police told them, just wait.
And this family really, they put up flyers. They were really searching for her, especially her daughter, Danita Carmichael, really cared for her mom deeply and was searching for her. And so this was really difficult for her.
She would never see her mom alive again. One day, Sowell would describe her fate and that of others. His favored method of murder was to use an electric cord or any cable nearby before pinning his victims to the ground. He would act quickly, subduing in seconds, showing no mercy.
I don't know. I think I just shoot.
Choked them.
Nothing like beat,
Yeah.
No.
In 2018, an investigation would begin about why detectives had failed to arrest Sowell before he was eventually hauled in for questioning. His killing was relentless. Next to enter the foul stench of his crack den was Michelle Mason.
Michelle Mason was finally getting the life she'd always wanted. She had spent so many years in a haze of drugs. She was hooked on heroin and crack. But by 2001, she was really starting to get things turned around. And her family just remembers this was really the happiest time of her life. She was living on her own. She had friends, real friends, and She had kicked her drug habit. She was clean and sober.
But one day in 2008, she seems to have come across Anthony Sowell.
On an October morning in 2008, when Michelle left the house and said she'd be back, and she never came back, her family knew something was wrong. They filed a missing persons report. They put out flyers all over the neighborhood.
15 months after claiming his first victim, Anthony Sowell has killed again for the 5th time.
On October 29th, 2009, some Cleveland police officers, some detectives actually went to Anthony Sowell's home on Imperial Avenue, and they were looking to arrest him. A woman had accused him of rape. When they went to the house, he was not there.
So they went away, figuring the overwhelming smell, which they could not miss, was from Ray's sausage store next door. How many more women would Anthony Sowell attract to 12205? What mistakes would he make before police would finally arrest him? It was October 20th, 2009, when a man walking on Imperial saw a woman falling from an upstairs window of 12205. He didn't know her, but it was obvious something very bad had been going on.
12205 Imperial.
He'd got away with so many rapes and murders, Sowell sets about trying to get away with this latest attack.
A week later, she does talk. She goes to police and she tells them what happened.
The Cleveland police, who had known about complaints related to the man who lived inside 12205, knew about his past as a convicted rapist. They only now decided to go inside and take a good look around.
October 29th, police go to Anthony Sowell's home with a search warrant and an arrest warrant. Sowell isn't there. They go inside. The place is just unbelievable. It's trash everywhere, clothes strewn around. It smells unbelievable.
They entered the home and they found the bodies of 2 women who were basically sitting out in the open, decomposing.
They're just lying there, rotting, and they're next to a shovel, and the police don't know what they have on their hands here, but they know they need help, so they call in other officers to help.
Once they found that, they called in a lot more police and some crime scene investigators. And over the course of maybe a week or more, they found many more bodies.
There was no immediate sign of Anthony Sowell, but it wouldn't be long before he reappeared in the neighborhood.
On October 31st, police find Anthony Sowell walking down the street about a mile from the house. They arrest him. They charge him with 5 counts of murder. But the bodies keep turning up.
Detectives are staggered to learn that Sowell does not know how many bodies he had hidden around his property.
All I can say is under 10. That's all I. So, hold up. Let me see.
If you were in my shoes, what would you want me to tell you? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
They cordon off the house. They cordon off the yard. They find 3 more bodies in the house, 2 in a crawl space.
It turns out that there was 11 women total who had gone missing since about 2007.
So we have 11 women, all of them black, missing since 2007, all dead, all here at the house at 12205 Imperial Avenue.
The identifications of the women begins. Christine Dozier, Tashana Culver, Tonya Carmichael, LaShonda Long, Michelle Mason. They hear the stories of others, like Kim Smith.
Kim Smith loved her father. She and her father took care of each other. He had a spinal injury and had trouble getting around, so Kim she looked after him. She would get him to his doctor's appointments. She would cook for him. But Kim was hanging out with the wrong crowd. She was smoking a lot of crack. And she was little by little not showing up as often. When she disappeared, her family didn't report her missing.
You had a body that was right here. You had a body that was over here. He had a bag. There was a body in there. Hold on, look, I ain't finished. And you got a body behind the wall.
With a lot of dirt back there, too.
A lot of dirt all over that body.
Next was Nancy Cobb.
In April of 2009, Nancy went missing. Her family filed a missing persons report. They put up flyers all over the neighborhood at the local businesses, on telephone poles, everywhere. They were frantic to find her.
They never did. They identify Imelda, known as Amy Hunter.
Amy Hunter adored books when she was a little girl. Her family called her a bookworm, and they said that she really loved reading the classics. But Amy's life would not have a storybook ending. By the time she was 14, she was pregnant, reportedly by a teacher who got her drunk at a party. Her baby was born deaf and with cerebral palsy, and Amy was devastated, and her friends said that she turned to crack cocaine as a sort of comfort, and it really took over her life.
A life which ended inside the Sowell House of Horrors. Sowell, under interrogation, affects madness. It was all a dream, he says. He did not know real from unreal. They ask him about another woman identified. Her name, Janice Webb.
Janice Webb always loved her East Cleveland neighborhood where she grew up. It was home to her, and she loved her family. But unfortunately, she fell into the same trap that so many people in the neighborhood had fallen into, and that was the drugs.
You got 4 bodies up top. You got 1 body in the basement. There's no more room in the house for bodies. So you gotta go outside. This would make her most likely the last one.
Not the last one. Talacia Fortson was Sowell's 10th victim, a mother of 3 whose drug problems meant that her children had been taken away from her. Her remains found buried in the garden.
In early June of 2009, Talacia dropped by her adoptive mom's house to bring her some groceries, and then she left saying she'd be back, and she never came back. Her adopted mom reported her missing.
Diane Turner, mother of 6, was victim number 11. Her body remained unclaimed, unrecognized in the city morgue for nearly a year.
She had been sober for almost 2 full years. Unfortunately, she never really learned how to be a good mom. And so the authorities said that she was a danger to her child, and they took her baby away when her baby was just 4 days old, and it devastated her. So pretty much then is when her family and friends say that Diane just gave up. Her body was found in the 3rd floor bedroom of Anthony Sowell's home at 12205 Imperial Avenue.
The interrogation was not a difficult one if the target was to get a confession. Sowell could hardly deny his guilt, and any pretense of insanity soon disappears. For interrogators, the priority was to get the truth out of Anthony Sowell, not to show how they were feeling, shock at hearing of how a serial killer had behaved quite so monstrously.
As detectives, you have to remove the emotional side as far as looking at that person's life. It's important to know the facts and who that person is, who your victims are, and sometimes you get to know the families very well, and you feel it's a calling, it's a mission to be able to provide answers to what happened to their child or their loved one.
Sowell had appeared as a party guy with a warm welcome to the women of Mount Pleasant, whose lives had taken a terrible turn for the worse, and they had trusted him. The mistake Sowell had made in order for detectives to be led to a macabre mausoleum at 12205 was simple. He allowed one victim too many to escape.
That was Anthony Sowell's killer's mistake. He let one of his victims get too close to a window, and she did what she had to save her life. She jumped out that 2nd-story window. She's the one who got away. And that's what it took to get Anthony Sowell finally arrested, finally stopped from his killing spree.
Campaigners argued in 2018 that it was a killing spree which could and should have been stopped after the first report of a woman who had gone missing. And again, after women had lived to tell the tale of torture inside 12205.
It was a sobering moment for Cleveland to realize that 11 citizens could go missing and nobody could make the connection that they were all in the same place, had all been killed by the same man.
For a while, the house was left standing, a reminder of Sowell's crimes where artifacts of the women had been abandoned. Clothing and jewelry left behind in the upstairs apartment of his home. The decision was taken in 2010 to pull down 12205.
People moved quickly to get control of the house so that they could knock it down. And, you know, within the year, the house was bulldozed and made into an empty lot. And there's been plans in the works for almost 5 years now to put some kind of memorial at that site. I think it left the whole community numb. You know, how could we let this happen? How could we let this happen?
How indeed. Sowell had killed and raped and killed, over a 3-year period, at the end of which time his mistake was to run out of luck when a survivor convinced police to look under the trash inside 12205.
Essentially, people like Anthony Sowell and other serial rapists that have since been discovered, they were smarter than the police. They were smarter than the community. They knew that these women, and they, you know, the women probably knew in some ways too that nobody would care.
Police had been warned about Sowell on a number of occasions and even had the right to ask to go inside the home of the registered sex offender. But they did not dig too deeply into a man who lived in a neighborhood that officers did not like to frequent.
Actually, sheriff's deputies visited his house and he had to check in regularly as a sex offender. And I think the same week as these bodies were discovered, they had checked in on him at his home, and they had just never entered his home because that wasn't part of what they did. If they did, they probably would have noticed something amiss or smelled the foul odor that neighbors had been complaining about for years, but couldn't really pinpoint, where it was coming from.
The detective story which led police to the house of a serial killer does not reflect well on the Cleveland police force. That they got the final piece of the puzzle into the disappearance of women in Mount Pleasant was more about luck than judgment. Kidnap women too often, and eventually one will escape to raise an alarm that will finally be heard.
She fell out the window upstairs on the second floor.
Okay, are you there?
She lay on the ground, butt neck.
Are you?
Sowell was given the death penalty in 2011. The sentence was never to be carried out. He died of natural causes in 2021. A world-renowned city of learning, one boasting a thriving market in books.
The first edition market is quite a buoyant one, and in terms of the top-level books, they can be worth a huge amount of money.
And where there's money, there is crime. Amidst the honey-coloured stone and splendour of Oxford, a brutal murder.
Following the discovery of a man's body in Oxford on Thursday the 7th of April, we have launched a murder investigation. Although he hasn't been formally identified, I'm satisfied that person is a man called Adrian Greenwood, who was 42 years old.
There was a frenzied attack. Greenwood was stabbed multiple times.
And taken from his house, a copy of Wind in the Willows worth £50,000. Bizarrely, the killer pauses as he escapes the scene.
He takes a photo of himself outside the house with blood on his face. I don't know what he was thinking.
He was thinking big and targeting the rich and famous.
Once they start looking at what's on that laptop, they find this Excel spreadsheet hit list which, besides Adrian Greenwood's name, they also find several wealthy celebrities' names, including Kate Moss and Simon Cowell.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Michael Danaher as guilty of murder? What would be a killer's mistake? It's a story which could have been lifted from one of the novels of Colin Dexter and the depictions of his central character Morse in a British TV series. The brutal murder of an author who was part of a closed world in Oxford, one where books are a currency which create wealth, where collectors of all backgrounds will pay what it takes.
Sometimes it's with a view to investment, but more commonly it's the sort of obsessive activity that you often get with collecting.
Undiscovered in family cupboards, garages, on bookshelves and in antique shops, there are rarities worth tens of thousands of pounds. To sell for that much is often about the nuances of what a book has to offer.
Often the value is based on particular attributes. The presence of a dust jacket, the presence of an author's signature, where the author's signature is uncommon, can make a huge difference to the value and add tens of thousands of pounds.
In 2016, Adrian Greenwood was an almost stereotypical product of the Oxford academic world. He had read politics, philosophy and economics at Christ Church College and stayed on in the city. By his early 40s, he was living not far from where he'd been a student. He was a twice-published author, dealt in classic cars and works of art, and had become one of a select few trading in rare books.
Mr. Greenwood is well known in Oxford, and we know that, or we believe that he was running a number of businesses.
He was a collector of historical books, antique books, books of historical interest, first editions, that sort of thing.
Within Oxford, there are only really sort of three or four people at a time in terms of actual dealers with premises or websites and that sort of actual businesses as such. So it's quite a close community, and with that, a fairly competitive community.
Greenwood had become highly considered in the closed book world, good at the hard sell, a natural at uncovering rarities.
Dealing in rare books as opposed to general book selling has different processes that take a large amount of your time. There's a lot of research that goes into both finding the books originally and finding out about the books when you've got them in hand, and you need to be able to catalogue them and turn them into something of interest. A lot of that is storytelling, making the books sound interesting, because if people are going to part with a large amount of money, they want to have a real feel for the book and a sense of value and interest that they can share once they have it as their own possession.
Adrian Greenwood focused on a lucrative speciality.
He specialised mostly in modern first editions and had a line in particular authors such as J.K. Rowling, and fine copies of particularly scarce books. He was somebody that was able to find things that other people couldn't, essentially, which is a large part of the trick.
A trick that Greenwood had pulled off.
Adrian Greenwood had a first edition of a Harry Potter book.
With the J.K. Rowling books, they are a phenomenon in the sense of contemporary authors whose work has almost immediately become collectible in a very high sort of bracket of value. The first book in particular can go for tens, £20,000 if it's in any sort of good condition.
His discovery of the first edition made the news.
And this was seized upon by the local media and local press, and there was a certain amount of publicity around it, and he was photographed and seen to have this valuable and expensive book.
The first edition was exhibited at a book fair, and then it was stolen. Greenwood warned whoever the thief was that getting rid of it would not be easy.
It would be incredibly difficult to resell a book that had been stolen, because both the community of the book trade is closely knit enough that word would circulate that it would make it impossible to sell to the trade, but also any form of public marketing of the book would attract attention, because the interest in finding those particular titles is so large. They're not going to go unnoticed, and obviously you need them not to go unnoticed if you want to sell them. So the idea that you could then resell the book for anything like its original market value just wouldn't be possible.
Sure enough, the stolen Harry Potter first edition was found abandoned outside an Oxford store and subsequently returned to Adrian Greenwood. That was not his only book of value. He had placed an advert online for a copy of Wind in the Willows with a sale price of just under £50,000. The word was out. Adrian Greenwood had some very valuable books, and at least one person was following the story with a self-serving interest, a man called Michael Danaher.
Michael Danaher was known as the Gentle Giant. He's a large man, very tall, 25 stone or so. He'd worked with his wife at John Lewis in Peterborough, and they had 2 sons. He then left that job and went to work as a manager for an engineering firm. His marriage broke up, but he still maintained contact with his sons, who were at that time sort of 9 and 15 years old, and he saw them at weekends and tried to play his part as their father as best he could in the circumstances.
Michael Danaher, Mr. Ordinary, but one with issues.
Danaher had money problems, serious money problems. He was in debt.
He wouldn't tell his ex-wife or his sons about it, and tried to cope, and tried various means of coping so that he could make life as normal as possible for both himself but also for his sons. And one of the things he did was to look at eBay and find low-value things to buy and then sell on again and make a little bit of money to keep his head above the water. But it wasn't really working, and he was kind of sinking further and further into a sort of morass of debts.
He couldn't see any way out of that, apart from crime.
Not petty crime either. The Gentle Giant wanted to score big. He began researching people to burgle. In early 2016, Danaher trawled the web looking for potential targets. A wealthy donor to a British political party, Adrian Beecroft, was one.
Danaher decided he was a worthy target, and he went and posed as a delivery driver at Beecroft's house in Hampstead. But his wife fought him off, essentially. He tried to push past her, and it was all bungled. And it would have been better for everybody concerned if Danaher had realised at this point this really wasn't his forte, and perhaps his ideas of making money ought to go in a different direction.
The criminal life of Michael Danaher had exposed him as something of an amateur. Still the attentive father at weekends, he was not put off, assiduously researching ways of getting rich quick and illegally.
He effectively found himself a hit list of people that he felt might be vulnerable, might be good targets to yield him a better return than he was getting on buying and selling on eBay. And there were people on that list who were like hedge fund managers and people who weren't known, but there were also celebrities on there who he thought would be vulnerable for some reason to him stealing from them.
TV star and entrepreneur Alan Sugar, model Kate Moss and former footballer Rio Ferdinand were all considered by Danaher as wealthy enough for him to consider breaking into their homes. But Danaher soon decided on an easier target. He remembered the story about the man who dealt in rare books. The two very different worlds of Adrian Greenwood and Michael Danaher were about to collide.
Danaher thinks there's money to be made in second-hand books.
The potential can be 20, 30, 40,000 and up. It's the sort of commodity where if scarcity comes into play and somebody wants it enough, then you're talking X amount.
And one of the people that he clearly discovered during his research on the internet was Adrian Greenwood.
The reason Danaher targeted Adrian Greenwood was because Greenwood had previously appeared in the media talking about the value of rare first edition books, and he thought, I'll get in on this. When Greenwood had appeared in the media, obviously he hadn't really thought about the fact that that would mark him out as a victim. He didn't have security in place. He was just living a normal life in his house in Oxford.
Danaher dug a little deeper. He discovered that Greenwood had valuable books for sale, in particular a first edition of Wind in the Willows, for which Greenwood was asking for £50,000.
Danaher's research also revealed that Adrian Greenwood worked from home. He uncovered precisely where he lived, the Iffley Road in Oxford. The more Danaher read, the more he could dream of what treasures lay inside.
Adrian Greenwood was fairly open about the valuable items that he owned, like this Wind in the Willows book. He'd had publicity, and Danaher had picked up on this. Greenwood really was a victim waiting to happen.
Danaher had already demonstrated that he was no criminal mastermind with his failed attempt at burglary of a family in Hampstead, London.
The stupidity of Michael Danaher is pretty much off the Richter scale.
Undeterred, he now had a new target in mind, the home of a man happy to boast of the valuable books that he had for sale, and who had one in particular on offer. Wind in the Willows, complete with a much vaunted dust jacket.
I can steal that, and maybe some other kind of things. That would bring about the end of my financial worries. He hatched a plan.
He plotted a route from Peterborough in south-central England to Oxford and to the home of Adrian Greenwood. When detectives investigate a case, they're led not by their instincts, but by the evidence they discover. Experienced criminals work hard not to leave a trail. They are wary of digital fingerprints trackable from their online behaviour. Michael Danaher was no criminal mastermind. By the 6th of April, he had left an array of evidence reflecting his plans on his laptop. He'd also made a note next to Greenwood's name in a spreadsheet detailing the pros and cons of potential actions.
He even had a reason column, and the comment against Adrian Greenwood was simply tosser.
Amongst other evidence later found at Danaher's home was a phone, one which had been adapted to work as a stun gun and which Danaher referred to as something he might use.
Danaher really hadn't put a lot of thought into this crime.
On the 6th of April, Danaher drove from Peterborough to Oxford.
Danaher had his target. He may not have known why it was so valuable, but he had seen online that Greenwood was trying to sell a children's book called Wind in the Willows, and he was trumpeting the small but vital attribute that made it very valuable, the one which would tempt collectors into spending big.
The Wind in the Willows is an example of a book that does not normally survive with a dust jacket. In terms of what it could sell for, we are talking more like £50,000. Without that, it's, you drop a zero off for the same book. That's the difference that thin bit of paper wrapping around the book can make.
Danaher drove the 2 hours from his home in Peterborough and arrived in Oxford. April 6th began as a sunny day. Nobody could possibly know that he was on a mission. He travelled on foot from a city centre car park to Iffley Road. As the day went on, the weather changed. Danaher can be seen that day on security footage.
He was captured on CCTV. A local bus captured Danaher on CCTV a couple of times.
As he walks along the Iffley Road, he can be seen checking inside his bag. It's unlikely that passers-by would have considered him worthy of their attention.
He went to Adrian Greenwood's house.
Greenwood didn't have CCTV. He didn't have a state-of-the-art alarm system in his house. All of these things which he very much should have had.
He was disturbed by Mr. Greenwood in the property, and that's where an altercation or fight took place between them.
There was then a frenzied attack. Greenwood was stabbed multiple times. In fact, Danaher stabbed him so hard with a kitchen knife that the handle snapped off the blade. Greenwood stood very little chance.
Adrian Greenwood was stabbed.
We do know that he ended up stabbing him several times, and Adrian Greenwood bled to death.
A seasoned killer would know not to use the sort of knife that Danaher probably picked up from his victim's kitchen. Still, that seems to be what Danaher took.
The knife is a large kitchen knife. It's not an ideal murder weapon. It might seem like one, but it's really not an ideal murder weapon. If you think about what a kitchen knife is designed for, it's designed for slicing and cutting. It's not designed for repeatedly stabbing into somebody. And so if you have a long knife like that, you might think that bodies are easy to stab, but actually getting a knife through the skin is quite difficult, and then it may go into the body okay, but then if it hits bone, it's going to bend again. So if you're repeatedly doing that with this long knife, it will bend, and if it's a cheap knife, the blade may snap off.
Michael Danaher's descent from happily married man and loving father to killer was complete. What he was about to do was finish the job that he had come for.
After he'd killed Adrian Greenwood by stabbing him multiple times, Danaher was looking around for things to steal.
He took Greenwood's wallet and his phone. On his earlier walk along the Iffley Road, Danaher will have seen that Greenwood received no visitors. He may well have felt confident of not being interrupted. He walked throughout the ground and first floor of the house, stepping in the blood of his victim. And then he left. What he did next has few parallels and exposed both a bizarre state of mind and a total absence of understanding how a later investigation might work. The amateur criminal had already made a catalogue of mistakes. His next one is perhaps the most memorable in the case of the murder of the Oxford bookseller. Michael Danaher took out his phone in broad daylight and captured his image.
When he left after 2 hours, he took a selfie outside the property showing himself there.
Danaher, after he'd murdered Greenwood, even took a selfie at Greenwood's house. Well, of course, that photograph contains a lot of metadata that would be able to place Danaher at that house at that time.
A selfie which displayed the blood of Michael Danaher from a cut that he seems to have sustained during the attack.
I don't know what Danaher was thinking taking a selfie of himself with blood on his face, but what he should have known is that one of the first things police do these days when they have a suspect is they seize their mobile phone, they seize their computer records, and they'll go through and they'll look at those things like their photos, the text messages they've sent, the phone calls they've made, and that's all evidence against them.
Danaher did not delete the picture.
He's fresh from killing Greenwood. He's just killed him. He's got his blood on his face. And he takes his photograph. Bizarre behaviour, having just killed somebody.
What kind of murderer takes a selfie of himself at the murder scene.
An amateur murderer, perhaps. Inside the home of Adrian Greenwood, a bloody scene. Danaher had not tried to cover his tracks. In fact, he'd stepped in them. He had not considered the presence of his DNA. Earlier in the day, he'd not bothered to consider the presence of security cameras around the city, or on buses which regularly travelled up the Iffley Road. There are 6 million security cameras at work in Britain at any one time. Experienced criminals know all about them, not Danaher. It was still daylight when Michael Danaher left the home of Adrian Greenwood. He had committed only the second crime of his life. The first had been a failed aggravated burglary and extortion. The second had been theft and murder. Both had been desperate attempts to dig himself out of a debt hole and retain face for his 2 children. But the amateur was simply not equipped to be a criminal. In his bag, he now had the rare copy of Wind in the Willows, the contents of Adrian Greenwood's wallet, and Greenwood's phone, still switched on. He had parked just off the road that he had earlier been seen walking along, and now returned to his Citroën Picasso.
He then gets in his car, still carrying Greenwood's mobile phone, and drives back to Peterborough.
We can tell that he's really got no sense of how he might be caught, what things he might have to take care of to make sure that the police can't follow him, because he takes no steps whatsoever to try to disguise the fact that he has made that journey.
As daily life continued in the busy city of Oxford, no alarm had been raised. The horrific murder had been inside a property at a time when neighbours were not at home. If Adrian Greenwood had screamed for help, he hadn't been heard. Danaher was on his way home, and although the killer had left a trail of evidence, one key mistake would still be needed to alert detectives to look for that evidence in the right places, to consider Danaher as a suspect.
Because Danaher was a previous good character, lived 100 plus miles away, no connections to the area, it might have been very difficult to find him and connect him into the murder.
To find the selfie, they'd have to find the phone it was taken with. To compare the murder weapon with knives in Danaher's home, they would need good reason to search his home. Before police could uncover who had killed Adrian Greenwood, they would need a lead for them to connect Danaher to that crime. Even if an image of a suspect would emerge from CCTV, there was no match to Danaher's face on the National Criminal Database.
Danaher had no criminal convictions, not even a caution. He was completely off the police radar.
With no witnesses and no link between Greenwood and Danaher in the past, why would detectives begin to suspect him? There was something else. Adrian Greenwood was not always Mr. Popular. There was a possibility that he had enemies.
By all accounts, he wasn't an easy man to get on with. He'd made a number of enemies, both in his personal and in his business life. There's a number of stories about him, the most interesting of which perhaps is that he once is meant to have held a washing machine installer hostage in his house for a number of hours because he wasn't satisfied that the door on the machine was working properly. Here we have somebody whose life and the way that they're perceived by other people might make you think that there were lots of people who had reason to do him harm or to do him down.
Solving the case of the murder of the Oxford bookworm may not be straightforward. By 4 o'clock on April 6, 2016, Adrian Greenwood's death had still not been reported. Michael Danaher had time to get away from the crime scene. He hoped his life could now be turned around. No more debts, some spare money to look after the family. Back in Peterborough, Michael Danaher has returned to the life that he was trying to escape. His was a lonely world. Binge eating. Binge drinking. But he had now taken action and was about to make more mistakes. It was time to cash in on his stolen booty.
He puts that book on eBay.
April 7th, 2016 was a day of showers with extended periods of spring sunshine in Oxford. As throngs of tourists, students and locals came and went and commuters headed to and from work, the body of Adrian Greenwood still lay behind closed doors in the hall of his house. That afternoon, it was discovered.
On the morning of the 7th of April, Mr. Greenwood's young cleaner comes in to clean the house as usual, and she's confronted with this horrific scene of her employer lying dead in the hall in a pool of blood. And she's just completely shocked by this, becomes hysterical, runs into the street, thereby raising the alarm. Passers-by come to see what the commotion is, and one of them's a nurse from the local A&E, and she goes in to try and assist, but of course, Adrian Greenwood is long dead.
In the city of fictional crime stories, a real-life murder mystery had begun.
The police arrive. They already know it's a murder scene. One of the first things they're going to be doing is photographing the scene in detail and taking a video to note the position of all the objects and the body. They're going to be taking close-up pictures of the body before they move anything. They're then going to be collecting evidence. So they'll be looking for signs of a struggle.
Police turn up at Adrian Greenwood's house and they start a full forensic examination. They discover that Adrian's phone, wallet and bank cards are missing.
Because Danaher had never committed crimes for which he had been convicted, there was no immediate match between DNA found at the scene and on the national database.
My appeal to the public today is twofold. First of all, anybody that knows Mr. Greenwood, has seen him recently or has had any contact with him, either professionally or personally, and hasn't spoken to the police to make contact with us. We will deal with all information that we receive sensitively. And secondly, you'll see a clip of CCTV on the screen. This CCTV was taken in Sainsbury's in Kidlington in the early evening of Tuesday, the 5th of April, just before 6 o'clock. That's the last sighting that we have of Mr. Greenwood.
Detectives discover that Mr. Greenwood has an occasionally prickly personality. They hear how he locked a delivery man inside his Iffley Road home when angered with the quality of a product. That the world of rare books in which Mr. Greenwood worked saw big money sales. The real reason for the murder soon emerges.
They start looking for a motive, I suppose, and to see if anything's been stolen and if it actually is a burglary or a robbery. And it becomes apparent that missing from Adrian Greenwood's house is a very rare 108-year-old first edition of The Wind in the Willows. And, you know, this is something which is of great value to collectors.
As investigators collect and collate evidence, no piece of factual data is too small.
It's important that we're able to build a picture of Mr. Greenwood and his lifestyle so that we can carry out the inquiries that we need to carry out in order to find out who's responsible for his death.
As they search the property, they discover that Mr. Greenwood's credit cards are missing, and something else.
It's also discovered that Adrian Greenwood's mobile phone has been stolen too. And not only has it been stolen, but it's not been switched off.
Would this prove to be the killer's mistake, the one which would point detectives in Danaher's direction?
So the phone's communicating with the network for a further 3 hours after he's murdered. And of course, every time it communicates to the network, it betrays its position and where it is.
Even though he's not using Greenwood's phone, that phone is continually signalling to the mobile phone masts that it passes, and police can track where that phone has been and where it ends up.
So the police were able to do cell site analysis. That means they can track that phone's movements.
And from that, pretty quickly, police were able to plot, well, Greenwood's phone has gone from Oxford to Peterborough. And that's a fantastic lead in their investigation because it suddenly narrows down the field of people who could have committed this crime to people who were travelling at that time between Oxford and Peterborough.
Michael Danaher, of course, lived in Peterborough, but at that stage of the inquiry, police knew only that someone had stolen Adrian Greenwood's phone, that he had probably also stolen a rare book, that whoever it was the key suspect in Mr. Greenwood's murder, that he had travelled from Oxford to Peterborough in the hours after the killing. They could still not know that that man was Michael Danaher. He was at home waiting for someone to buy his rare copy of Wind in the Willows on eBay. But the picture was coming together.
The business of not turning off the mobile phone you've stolen again tells us that Danaher was a bit of an amateur at this, really. I think it's pretty common knowledge that mobile phones, when switched on, can be tracked and can be traced.
This was the challenge facing detectives, to sift through security footage featuring multiple thousands of vehicles that had travelled from Oxford's Iffley Road on April 6, 2016, and then on to Peterborough.
From more than 5,000 that they started with, they are able, after a time, to narrow it down to just 20 vehicles. 20 vehicles that went from Oxford to Peterborough in the time frame we're looking at.
Until eventually they found just one car which had followed that same route as Greenwood's mobile phone. That car was a blue Citroën Picasso, and the number plate revealed that it belonged to Danaher.
The noose around his neck was tightening.
Danaher was oblivious. He was still hoping for a big sale of Wind in the Willows, to make a new start. Then came a knock on the door.
All this analysis, which sounds like a mountain of work, the Thames Valley Major Crime Team achieved in just 3 days. And so by the 10th of April, they have their suspect arrested. They've gone, 50-year-old Michael Danaher is arrested on suspicion of the murder of Adrian Greenwood.
It had been around 100 hours since Michael Danaher had committed just the second crime of his life. Was he about to pay for it by spending a life behind bars? As Oxford had woken to the news of a bloody murder in the shadow of its world-famous colleges, people living in the city may have expected that a lengthy police inquiry would be needed. In fact, just 4 days after the murder, the police had a man in their sights: Michael Danaher.
When he's arrested, Danaher vehemently denies the allegations. Nothing to do with me, don't know anything about it.
Once Danaher's become a murder suspect, police get a warrant and they go and look in his flat. They find several things which are really, really incriminating. For one thing, they find a pair of boots with blood still on them.
The first thing that police saw when they entered Danaher's home was that there were a pair of bloodied boots on the carpet, on the mat. He hadn't even washed them off, let alone get rid of them.
Those boots had the blood of Adrian Greenwood on them.
Danaher's mistakes are coming home to roost.
They find an absolute treasure trove of evidence.
A stun gun, which is disguised as an iPhone, it's not the sort of thing that a law-abiding gentle giant may have in his house, you would think.
So not only did Danaher leave this massive digital footprint, he then kept hold of the book that he's stolen and left it sitting around in his flat.
That enabled them to search eBay records, and indeed, Danaher had already listed this first edition of Wind in the Willows on eBay, and they had that record of it.
Yet more evidence is discovered on Danaher's computer.
Once they start looking at what's on that laptop, they find this Excel spreadsheet hit list, which besides Adrian Greenwood's name and the expected take, rare books, and the modus, any. They also find several wealthy celebrities' names, including Kate Moss and Simon Cowell.
He had a hit list of his intended targets on this madcap scheme he had to go and rob the wealthy to pay his debts off.
Detectives are looking for a match to the knife handle discovered at the crime scene. It doesn't take them long.
They find an envelope containing this broken knife blade, which has Adrian Greenwood's blood still on it.
And of course, that's then able to be physically matched back to the handle that was found at the scene in Adrian Greenwood's house where he was murdered. So the evidence now is mounting up. It's virtually game, set and match. It's such strong and such persuasive evidence.
There is more to come. The evidence that Danaher himself had sent from Iffley Road.
The selfie with the blood still on his face.
That photograph contains data which put Danaher at the scene of the crime, at the time of the crime, and Danaher actually had blood on his face when he took that photograph. It is stupidity beyond compare.
Danaher made a catalogue of errors in his crimes. He had the hit list at home that was easily findable, that showed the amount of premeditation there was. He used his own car. He was completely oblivious to closed-circuit television and automatic number plate recognition when he used that car for that journey.
The search of his flat unearthed amongst the detritus of Danaher's life the book that he thought would change everything.
They found the first edition Wind in the Willows book, the 108-year-old, £50,000 antique book that Danaher was willing to sell on eBay.
The catalogue of mistakes that Danaher had made seemed never-ending.
It's almost as if he was trying to be caught. You know, you couldn't really do much more other than phone the police as soon as you'd finish and say, come and get me. There was a lot of work in this case for the investigation team, and they did it very well and very swiftly. But I have to say, it wasn't difficult when someone's making all the errors like Michael Danaher was.
Which of the errors proved to be the turning point which led officers to Danaher's door? Rarely can a murder inquiry have been so led by one piece of compelling evidence to complete the picture of the suspected killer.
Danaher's really fatal mistake was taking Greenwood's phone, because that enabled police to track the journey that the phone travelled on and then narrow down the cars that had similarly travelled that route to pinpoint Danaher.
He kept Adrian Greenwood's mobile phone switched on for 3 hours.
That was like putting a tracker in your pocket. It put him from Greenwood's house back to his apartment. The evidence trail was substantial, it was watertight, it was irrefutable.
They'd never have got to him as a potential suspect if he hadn't have left the phone switched on so they knew to look in Peterborough.
The case against Michael Danaher was compelling, and given the number of mistakes made by the killer, it might be considered as an easy arrest. Not necessarily the case.
Even when you're confronted by a frankly quite dumb murderer like Michael Danaher, you have to get the evidence right. You cannot take your foot off the pedal or for a moment be complacent. As much evidence as you may have, you still have to present it properly, thoroughly to the court. You don't want them getting away.
But aside from the forensic and physical evidence, Danaher's own excuses were as weak as the thinking which went into the crime.
When he was asked to explain this hit list spreadsheet at court, Danaher said it was put on his computer by somebody else, a mystery man who he was unwilling to name. Of course, it was just such a ridiculous story that it wasn't believed by the jury, and he was duly convicted of murder. And the aggravating factors of the premeditation and the desire for financial gain from it meant that he was given a recommendation that he should serve 34 years before he's eligible to apply for parole. And not only that, he got another 7-year sentence for possessing the stun gun, because that technically is a firearm, and of course it's a firearm that's prohibited and a serious offence.
The sentences for murder and possession of a stun gun are to run concurrently. When Adrian Greenwood moved as a student to Oxford, he soon learned the value of scarcity. The economics scholar knew how supply and demand worked. If he could find something hard to come by which others wanted, he would benefit. Greenwood was a natural researcher, good at separating the commonplace from those books which would command a high price. He was oblivious to those who would seek a quick win. Men down on their luck, like Michael Danaher. A fantasist and inept killer who left a trail of evidence to prove the case against him, but who might have got away with his crime, but for the rookie mistake of stealing a phone from the scene of a murder and leaving it switched on as he drove all the way home. That was the killer's mistake, which led detectives to the door of Michael Danaher.